Paul begins by saying, you know, from the first day that I got here, what manner I've always lived among you. You know, I love that. You know, there's something to be said for leading by example. Paul's first appeal to these men in his message to them was to help them or to remind them or ask them to remember what they knew about him from day one. What do you remember about me? If you go read sometime 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul, in writing to the people there, loved, and he does it a lot in his epistles, he loved to appeal to what people knew. He will say there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 1, you know, and in verse 2, you know, and in verse 5, you know, and in verse 9, you remember, and verse 10, you're witnesses, and verse 11, you know, because the proof of leadership is in the pudding. Leadership, as Paul taught it to these men, was first a matter of example. Talk is cheap. You know, the old do as I do and not as I do, or do as I say, I guess, not as I do. I'll get that one right. It doesn't really fly very well when it comes to leadership. And notice he didn't say, you've heard me say, but rather you know me. Paul's example was certainly one that these men could follow. If they were all like Paul, the church would have been better for it. I remember years ago sitting at Costa Mesa Calvary, and Pastor Chuck was teaching, and he said one time to all of us young kids, if the whole church was just like you, would it be a better church or not? How many studies would have to close for lack of attendance? How many missionaries brought home for lack of support? How many prayer meetings, doors just closed for lack of people caring to come and pray? If the whole church was just like you, and I went, oh, I hate when he does that. But Paul did it a lot. You know, there's nothing you don't know about the way that I live my life. And it's true for parents, it's true for pastors, it's true for leadership. Jesus placed an awful great emphasis upon it. He said there to the disciples in John chapter 13, I have given you an example, after he washed the feet of the disciples, as I have done, so should you now do. Follow my example. In the book of Acts chapter 1, verse 1, the words begin with, you know, this is all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. He didn't just talk a good game, he did it. When Peter wrote his first epistle, he said to the pastors, now you shepherd the flock of God among you as overseers. Don't do it by compulsion, do it willingly. Don't do it for dishonest gain, but do it eagerly. Don't do it as lords over the people, but rather as those that have been entrusted to you, and be an example to the flock. Show yourself. And Paul says to this room filled with men who were serving in Ephesus, you know my example to you. Paul even invited others to copy his example, and when he wrote to the Corinthians, it says, imitate me like I imitate Christ. Boy, could you say that? Do like me. Most of us go, no, do like him. But Paul said, do like me. You know, from the first day that I arrived in Asia, in what manner I always lived among you. Example begins immediately. You know, when Paul first pulled into town, you know, you only get one chance to make a good impression. And Paul did not ascribe to the idea of trying to fit in now and then later be a witness. He blew into town as a believer in Christ. You know what kind of life I lived from the first day that I showed up. And for 3 years, they watched their pastor under all circumstances and emotions and times of life. And Paul was the example of the pastor, of the elder, of the saint. It takes time to stand fast through the seasons, doesn't it? Paul says, you saw me under all kinds of conditions, which is, I think, one of the reasons you don't lay your hands suddenly on new believers or put them in places of responsibility. There's no shortcut to growing up in the Lord. But Paul said, look, you've known me at all times. When the spring came and hope rose eternal and everything began to blossom, you know how I was feeling good then. And when the summer came and the fruit came in and the thrill of God's work, but you know, the fall follows. The fall, when God starts to prune things back and the dead branches have to be cut down and some of the leaves have to be pulled off. And then there's that winter time when, you know, you're walking with the Lord, but you don't feel a thing and God doesn't seem to be doing a thing. And you're waiting on the Lord. You know, in all manner of times. in all manner of situations. You've seen me in the good times and in the bad, the up times and the down times. And I'll tell you what, Paul didn't waver. Some folks are just, they run with the tide. No stability, like a kite in the wind. But not Paul. You've seen my life. There's nothing hidden. You know what I'm all about.